he's not doing it in the middle of a department store, you know? He's not going to Harrods and just walking around naked, right? He can make a choice to do it in certain situations. And the choices where he was alleged to have done it are situations where he was the one with the power. When these behaviors do exist in autistics, they are not as calculated or as planned. It's much more spontaneous. I would have expected a lot more stories about Greg Wallace doing this in a lot of other contexts if keeping pants on was such a struggle. They should be hearing stories about him as a teenager having a struggle with it, or him in the middle of a department store having struggle with it, or him meeting the King of England and having a struggle with it, or, but those stories aren't coming out. Hello and welcome to the Trauma-Informed SLP. I am Camille, a licensed speech-language pathologist in the United States. That's what the SLP stands for. I'm also neuroqueer and super fixated on trauma-informed care, and I use all that knowledge to unpack some things. So, today, I'm doing another response video, but I like to call them yes and videos in the first rule of improv kind of vibe of basically picking videos that I already really totally agree with and that are fantastic videos. And then when I feel like I can offer a little extra perspective, especially as a clinician, I just thought, this might be a good one to do. Not too coincidentally, this is another video from the channel I'm Autistic Now What? Because like I've said before, I think Meg does very excellent videos, well-researched, well-written. She has great explanations on things, and I love that she dives into these type of topics. And not too unexpectedly, this basically came up on my private YouTube channel, and I watched it and thought, okay, that is a really good video. And I think I also have a little additional perspective to give as a clinician, because in clinical terms, especially for certain people with maybe, say, higher support needs or something, some of these things might get a little muddy. It might sound like we're talking about the same stuff. And I'm going to talk about what differentiates it a little bit more from the clinical side of things. So this is the second or maybe the third, I'm not sure. She's doing a really great video series, okay? This is the deal. Over there on that channel, Meg is doing a really great video series on prominent, celebrity status men using a recent diagnosis of autism as a way to excuse allegedly criminal, if not just incredibly unpleasant type of behavior. I think it's a great idea. I think it's needed. Somebody out there needs to talk about this, really, And on this particular one, she's talking about a celebrity that is, I guess, pretty prominent in the UK, but I don't really know him at all. So I've never watched the UK version of MasterChef, I guess is what he's from. GregG Wallace, I believe, is his name. So let's go ahead and start with Meg introducing what's going on with Greg at this moment in time.
So there seems to be a trend, or an epidemic, if you will, of men, very prominent, powerful men, using autism as an excuse and/or an explanation for very serious actions or allegations.
A few years ago, I was informed I was high-functioning autistic.
And come to find out, it's really a case of autism.
Look, I know I sometimes say or post strange things, but that's just how my brain works.
Am I autistic? They went, yes, very, 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 very. You are very on the spectrum.
There are 3 people in particular who all happen to be men who have recently invoked their autism diagnosis in a time of crisis. They decided that being disabled was a suitable and reasonable defense. So in this series, Men and the Autism Excuse, I want to pick apart whether autism can truly excuse or even explain what these men have done or allegedly done. In the first video, we covered British fantasy author Neil Gaiman, and this one is about, part 1, the man, Greg Wallace. If you don't know who Greg Wallace is, well done, congratulations. I will quickly get you up to speed. You will know imminently. Greg Wallace was until recently presenter of MasterChef and all of its different styles and flavors in the UK. He's been in the role for almost 20 years, and he's an extremely recognizable face on TV.
Total side note, but 20 years, man, I don't think MasterChef is still happening in the US. I mean, maybe it is still in some iteration, but that's a long time. Okay.
MasterChef. I didn't know this, but he actually isn't a chef. I feel like he kind of looks like a chef. He's not. Greg used to be a greengrocer. I feel like there's a lot of G's in that sentence. Greg used to be a greengrocer. He would approve. Saying greengrocer makes it sound quite quaint, but he was actually a super successful entrepreneur with a turnover of multiple millions of pounds before he started presenting.
I did actually have to look up because greengrocer is not a term we tend to use in the US. From what I gather, it kind of sounds a little like, depending on where you live in the US, you might have like those like kind of basket or bag delivery type things where like people, farmers, local farmers and stuff put together produce, essentially, like kind of packages of produce that gets delivered every week or whatever. It sounds a little more like that. It's a little akin to that. So he basically built his greengrocer company into this multi-million dollar or multi-billion pound company, and then was able to sell it, I believe. And then it sounds like that's when he maybe entered into BBC entertainment, MasterChef type stuff.
You'll hear people refer to him as a cheeky chappy, meaning he's a bit mischievous. He doesn't always say the right thing, but he's all the more likable and down to earth for it. British TV is kind of in love with innuendos, especially the cooking shows. For some reason, everything is moist and deep and soggy and probably phallic. MasterChef is no exception.
I do know about the soggy bottoms. I did watch plenty of Great British Bake Off. Is that what it is in the UK? Or the Great British Baking Show. It goes by the two different titles, and I can't remember which one is which. But I do love that one. I particularly love the BBC version of it with Mary Berry. She seems really lovely. I hope that she is lovely.
But contrary to what some people seem to think in the comments section for MasterChef Top 10 Innuendos, Greg absolutely didn't lose his job because of on-screen jokes. It is not simply that we have forgotten, as a nation, how to banter. So, part 2, what does he actually seem to be trying to excuse? At the end of last year, numerous women came forward with allegations against Greg Wallace. He has faced 83 allegations. The majority are inappropriate sexual comments, but again, not the comments made on screen.
I mean, the stuff he said to me, that isn't cheeky barrow boy Cockney humour.
But also being in a state of undress, groping and touching. Greg Wallace denies the allegations, but when MasterChef's production company, Banijay, commissioned a law firm to investigate, 45 of the allegations were substantiated. We don't know specifics about which allegations were and were not upheld. It doesn't go into that much detail, but we do know it included one allegation of being in a state of undress and another of unwanted physical contact. Out of the numerous women who've come forward with allegations against him, some of the most upsetting come from the ghostwriter of his 2013 autobiography, Life on a Plate.
So I'm going to go ahead and let her explain these allegations, but this is essentially why I wanted to kind of yes and this video, because similar to the Neil Gaiman issue, similar to I'm sure other celebrities in the future will probably also use this. The idea is like, oh, it's a sensory thing, or, oh, I just didn't know that it wasn't appropriate for me to ask that or to state that, or I thought I was complimenting a person, blah, blah, blah. And I think it gets muddied, and it does seem like a plausible potential explanation for the behavior for some people if there's kind of this lack of understanding of nuance when it comes to certain conditions. So it can include autism, depending on the person's particular profile, but also like traumatic brain injury, for example, especially if it's severe enough that they're in like an inpatient program. Sexual impulsivity is definitely a thing that you can see in certain populations. You also see it in dementia patients. You see it in people with any kind of brain issue that really impacts their impulsivity. I did a video on executive skills or executive functions, and disinhibition is one of those key factors that leads to this kind of stuff. So inhibition is the cognitive ability to stop yourself from doing something that might harm you or harm others. So either stop yourself from doing something or saying something even if you want to do the thing, you might hold yourself back because it's like, that's not actually a great idea to do. This is a skill that develops, ideally as you get much older, you get better at it. Question mark with the rise of TikTok and certain influencers. Maybe not for some, but typically the expectation would be as your prefrontal cortex continues to develop, which it does continue to develop past the age of 25. We now know that was a misinterpretation of a limitation put into place because people were studying essentially college students, people who were 25. So yeah, it keeps developing. But yes, this like prefrontal cortex area of our brain, this seems to be a key part that really needs to be functioning fairly well and be fairly well developed for people to have decent inhibition, okay? And I think anyone who is a parent or a teacher or a caregiver of a small child knows that little kids are pretty disinhibited, right? That's why you have to spend an excessive amount of time preventing them from harming themselves on some impulse, right? Like, I do want to put that thing in a socket. It's like, no, you don't. What are you doing? Put that away. We're not doing this. So that's sort of an extreme version of disinhibition. And even for adults, like, for example, with a brain injury or with dementia, they might have had really good inhibition for a while, but if they have a big enough injury, they can become rather disinhibited. And when it comes to attraction and sexual desire and things like that, a lot of people spend their day doing some level of inhibition for certain impulses in that arena, just throughout their adult life. And if that ability is taken away, then, well, all of the physiological urges or any particular desire in that realm now gets impulsively acted upon. And that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of distinguishing my experience. So I've had experience with brain injury patients. I worked on an inpatient floor of a hospital for a while. And I've also worked with autistic, particularly teenagers, usually teenage boys, that have similar impulsivity issues when it comes to this sort of a thing. And so I thought I might be able to bring a little perspective in what I see as some of the differences between Greg Wallace's, the allegations at least, the behaviors as they were described, and what I've seen in like students and patients who have genuine cognitive impairments when it comes to inhibition. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. I'm going to go ahead and let Meg explain these allegations. She included this as a chapter to say, like, if this is super, super upsetting to you or kind of triggering of a past experience, do please skip it. I will offer this same extension to anyone out there. But this is where she gets into a section where she describes some of the events. So if it gets too upsetting, please just skip ahead to the next chapter, okay?
So on one occasion, when she went alone to his flat, she says he answered the door with just a towel around his waist.
And so I said, oh, I'll come back later, you're not ready. And he said, oh, no, I've just been to the gym, I've just had a shower, don't mind me.
Once she went inside, he dropped the towel in front of her and told her that the pair of trousers that he wanted to wear were tucked behind the cushion that she was sitting in front of. She believed he deliberately orchestrated this because, why would your pants be in the living room at all, hidden behind a cushion when you knew you were about to have a guest?
Yeah, that's really weird. Like, who puts, like, I'm assuming they're kind of like folded up behind a cushion. That's a very strange place to put your trousers. I mean, it's not like he just tossed them there. It's not like they were just laying out, right? He like tucked them in. That's a little odd.
I kind of looked up and then he dropped the towel. So I just... In front of me. And I had a notebook. So I just put it like this. And I just said, just go and get dressed. And then he did. He went off and got dressed. I felt quite vulnerable because I'm on my own in a flat with a man who's naked.
She also describes sexual comments he made while she was interviewing him for his book.
He said several things to me, actually, which I'd actually like to read out. If you won't let me sleep with you, would you lick my arse? He said I should keep an open mind, and he keep his knob clean next time. What would you think if I put some of the eaten mess you're eating on my willy then?
Oh my God.
That gives me the ick. Wow. But he's trying to say it's just the autism. It's just the autism, guys. Wow. That is atrocious and gross. Really, really gross.
I can't imagine most women would receive any of these as light-hearted banter. Another time in his car, Shannon says that he repeatedly rubbed her thigh despite her pushing him away, and he only stopped when she threatened him. And on another occasion, she says he groped her in front of her younger brother.
I could feel him touching me around my backside, and my brother saw it. Out of everything that happened, that was the thing that was most mortifying and humiliating, because it was my younger brother who saw it.
And can you imagine, after all of that, she went away and wrote his book for him. And then he's the one credited with his name on the cover, which is, of course, how ghostwriting works. But I'm sure it's safe to assume he was paid significantly more than she was. Shannon says she stuck around because she was a freelancer. She needed the work. She turned down other work in order to do this job. And she also didn't speak out at the time because she'd signed an NDA for the job.
And one of the very first clauses in the contract actually stated that the writer understands that Wallace enjoys a high public profile and that her obligations to him of loyalty and confidentiality are therefore of particular significance.
Shannon wasn't the only one, and not to equate them because the allegations they're facing are very different. But as with Neil Gaiman, listening to these women's stories, you start to notice a pattern. Firstly, of Greg Wallace exposing himself, of him dropping his trousers in front of female co-workers, and he apparently doesn't wear any underwear.
He then dropped his trousers in front of me. I immediately turned and looked away, and he said, "Oh, I best not walk too quickly. I'm not wearing any underwear."
Okay. That's okay. Note that he called attention to the fact that he's not wearing any underwear. That's something I'm going to talk about in a second. I find that to be a red flag that this is not impulsivity, that he's actually calling attention to these things, including the tucking the pants behind or the trousers behind a cushion. Doesn't seem impulsive at that point, okay?
Trousers, and he had no pants on underneath, and his shirt was kind of hanging around his waist, and then he exposed himself to me. I think he made a reference to it afterwards in kind of a jokey way, like, "Oh, I never wear any pants."
So he's continuously calling attention to it, especially if the women look away, then he calls attention to it. So I just want to note that. Okay? Red flag.
Said that he pulled his trousers down in front of her. A woman who was a participant actually on the BBC Saturday Kitchen said he put his hand under the table and onto her groin. Another woman who says at an industry event in 2014, he put his hand up her dress.
There's also a theme of Greg making 0 to 100 sexual comments off screen in what, again, is supposed to be a professional setting.
He then replied very quickly, "Yeah." Then he showed her his meat, and then he thrusted a couple of times, his groin near me.
I came into the studio and was like, "Oh, hi, Greg. I've got something for you." And he said, "Oh, is it a present for my cock?"
It was very early morning, and we were in a retirement home, and Greg Wallace came in and launched into a soliloquy, essentially, a story of a sort of sexually inappropriate nature about his, well, now former wife.
And in the lift was a young girl who worked on another show. So the three of them were going up in the lift together, and completely unprompted, Greg Wallace described a sex act that he had performed on his then wife that morning.
And these women felt strongly that the intention was humiliation, to exercise his power as a presenter at the top of the food chain.
I felt at the time that he enjoyed making me feel uncomfortable.
So I blushed to the roots of my hair, had that strange feeling you have when you're embarrassed, when you want to cry.
I just wanted the ground to swallow me up. It felt like the humiliation and embarrassment.
You know, when these words were said to me, they literally made my stomach curl. You know, I was literally just they're almost like little word grenades, you know, that I think are designed to humiliate. Saying them aloud, you know, almost feels shameful. But I want to point out that I want to now pass that shame back to the person who actually said them.
As she should. She should put that shame back. So here's some red flags to me, as someone who's worked with people who have this type of that have the type of impulsivity that he's probably going to say this is related to if he's saying it's the autism. Red flags that it's not that is that he clearly, there's something, okay. The environments in which he does these things, the more atrocious dropping of pants seems to happen when he's alone with the woman. The groping someone, touching a woman while she's in a car with you, like, where is she going to go? What is she going to do against that? You know, like, you know, you can get away with that, right? And also there was a notice in that little past thing too, where they talked about him being at like a correspondent, like dinner or something, like an industry event. And he groped some, but like put his hand underneath her dress. Note that at the industry event though, he was not walking around without pants on. Just want that noted. The pants off moments seem to only be when he's in an environment where no one's going to tell him not to do that. This is an important distinction. I will get into that more in the future here.
There is this uncomfortable on-screen exchange from about 2013 that's resurfaced recently. Greg Wallace is tasting a lemon tart and he says,
I find it quite pleasant. Left to my own devices, I'll probably munch the living daylights out of your little tart. Very, very nice.
Excuse me?
And I don't know about you, but I've been in I mean, this is part of that like whole way back in 2012 or whatever, the Me Too movement thing that happened. I've had that happen where guys make inappropriate jokes and then you react like she did and then they make that face he did. That like gave me the ick. The face that he did right after that, the little like, what? What did I say? What did I do? That little thing. Ugh. I don't like it. I don't like it at all, right? And so this is what's being shown on screen here is if he meant it as a joke or not, she seemed to think it was extremely funny. Years later, we have people being offended on her behalf. What a strange world. So once again, this is like well, she laughed at it, so clearly she found it funny. Okay, well, raise your hand if you've ever laughed out of discomfort because you're not in the kind of situation where you can really speak out about your discomfort, right? Like, tons of people have had that experience in their life. And I mean, she's a contestant on a show. He's a judge on that show. Like, clearly, power differential here. Clearly, she's not going to just be like, don't talk to me like that judge guy who can get me kicked off the show, you know? So yeah, what else is she supposed to do but like kind of giggle it off? It's also a very common response for people socialized as women, right? Because especially amongst other men, like it's not uncommon for a woman to feel unsafe around men. I'll put it that way. Not uncommon, okay? Hence why we had the whole bear versus man debate of like, which would you rather be stuck in a room with, right? Which people obviously grossly misunderstood for their own devices sometimes, mostly men. It's really common for women to be socialized into this, okay, I'll just giggle and laugh and kind of try to move past this moment, even though I don't feel good about this and I feel very uncomfortable for some reason, right? And that reason is usually just feeling a general lack of safety, not feeling very emotionally or psychologically safe with this person because he did something beyond the bounds of what was expected in that particular environment, which, sure, that is something autistic people can definitely do. They can say things that are outside of the bounds of what was expected. But the hardening of his face was unsettling, you know, because if he tries to say it was just a joke, then it's like, why was he surprised if she laughed at a joke? Wouldn't you expect someone to laugh at a joke? You would think, right? Unless he was just like scripting or something, and it's just like a phrase that related to tarts. But at his age, he should know better, especially being on camera for as many years as he's been on camera. Like, autistics are capable of learning, and he should have learned by then. You know what I mean? So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to where we see a little clip of Greg Wallace's interview where he discusses receiving his autism diagnosis. Okay, so.
From a few months ago, seems like there are no NHS waiting lists here.
I spent 90 minutes with a psychiatrist in Harley Street.
The psychiatrist told him he was very, very autistic. Very, very on the spectrum, whatever that means exactly.
Yeah, I don't think very, very autistic is like a level of autism or something, you know? Never really heard that as a descriptor, but okay.
They're only half on. Greg is very, very on. I'm joking.
And then they got on a Zoom here and they said, you are. I said, am I autistic? They went, yes, very, 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 very. You are very on the spectrum.
He said he wasn't blaming his behavior on the diagnosis, but it did explain a hell of a lot of it. He also talks about discussing with his psychiatrist whether or not to go public with this diagnosis, and he told the psychiatrist that he thought someday he would.
These doctors who diagnosed me, they said to me, because obviously they knew who I was, they said, are you going to go public with this? And I went, well, I haven't made a decision yet, but at some stage, I think so, yes.
But at this time, there had already been news articles from several months prior in which his friends were quoted saying he might be autistic. So he definitely at least done some foreshadowing at this point. It certainly didn't seem like he was going to be shy about going public in the wake of these allegations. Anyway, apparently the psychiatrist warned him that he might not be believed, basically.
Because in our experience, people are skeptical.
And this psychiatrist also said most people at his age don't get a diagnosis until they're in trouble at work.
He said, in our experience, nobody your age, rarely gets diagnosed until they're in trouble at work.
I mean, Greg actually has a non-speaking autistic son.
I think she's about to say this. It's pretty common for it to be in families. There is a lot of evidence that there's a strong genetic component here.
But then Greg's friends came out again in July to say that he apparently has an inability to wear underwear because of his autistic sensitivity to labels and tight clothing. But that doesn't really explain why the trousers came off. Surely not having underwear on for sensory reasons is all the more reason that you'd be careful that your pants/trousers would stay on, would stay put.
If you think back to what I noticed, when there was like that like event that he was at or something, nobody said that he dropped his trousers there. I don't think he would, you know, if he was going to some sort of event. Oh, there's Athena. Hi, boo. What are you doing? Yeah, good, Athena. You know. So that was the main thing about the can't wear underwear because of sensory stuff. And it's like, well, okay, but he kept his trousers on when he was at some correspondent dinner thing for work. I would bet if he was ever invited to like meet with the King of England, he would probably be able to keep his trousers on. He clearly can keep them on while he's doing interviews with people. You know, he's only doing this whole dropping trousers in environments where he is in a position of power, right? Where he's kind of in charge, where he can get away with things, where he might be alone with somebody. So no, it's just kind of a he said, she said situation, right? And even if it's on the set, it's still his own show. He's still a big draw to the show, especially if he's one of the longtime hosts. I'm sure he still has some level of power there, right? Entertainment industry is notorious for having a huge power differential between like who's in front of the camera and how much of a draw they are for ratings versus like contestants and even like staff members, like cameramen and stuff, okay? Like there could just be a huge disparity there. And the people who really hold the purse strings are usually not on set. They're usually not there, you know? So I wanted to highlight that because in my experience with patients and with autistic teenagers and such who really struggle with the disinhibition around, you know, they feel like touching themselves. They feel like just, you know, dropping their pants and handling their little physical desires at that moment in time. They don't usually have any kind of awareness for who's in the room with them in terms of like, they're not just doing it in situations where they're in charge. In fact, it's usually quite the opposite. They are usually in more of the vulnerable position of being around a lot of caregivers or nurses or doctors, teachers. Like, they're around adults, they're around people who have some say over their care and how their day goes and that kind of a thing, right? They're not waiting until they're in private with someone where they suddenly have more power over that person, be it through like physical stature or not. It doesn't matter, because the impulsivity is the cognitive part that is leading them to do it whenever they get the inclination to do so, right? So it's not this kind of specialized, planned out, like, I'm going to do this in this setting because I'm going to be able to get away with it. That's not usually how impulsive people who struggle with impulsivity, that's not how they do it, you know? When I worked in skilled nursing facilities, people who had some type of dementia or some type of atrophy or something, or some other cognitive stuff happening, sometimes due to other like illnesses and stuff like that, you know, you might walk into their room and they might have stripped, but it's probably because they're hot, you know, or something. And it's like, maybe keeping clothes on them would be nearly impossible, possibly. But you could just tell them to put clothes on and they'd be like, oh, okay. You know, just, okay, you know, but like, they did it impulsively. It's not a planned thing. It's not like they knew I was coming, so therefore they stripped. No, it would be like the nursing staff would be like, we can never keep Mr. So-and-so dressed because he keeps whatever. He doesn't like the hospital gown, so he keeps taking it off. Like, it'll be stuff like that. And then usually, I mean, since they're inpatient, it's like the medical staff's all used to it, but usually it gets addressed by like, okay, if it's a sensory thing, then maybe the occupational therapist can come up with some type of clothing that will not affect them as much, that they would be willing to keep on their body. You know, different fabric, something like that, right? Maybe some sweatpants or some, you know, just some, cover up the privates, you know, they come up with some, right? And so that's usually how it's more addressed, is like, okay, if they're too impulsive and when they're uncomfortable or itchy, they're just gonna take it off. We got to figure out what will make them more comfortable, what's not itchy, what is something, what's not restrictive, what's something they can just keep on their body. That's usually the problem solving the staff members would do, right? When it comes to the more impulsive teenagers who don't really know what they're doing, we teach them societal rules around it. Quite frankly, that's usually how I would go, right? Where it's like societal rules of when you're in your speech sessions, the pants stay on and the hands stay out of the pants. I know colleagues who are like, hands stay above the table, right? Like, we keep it in visual. We make sure we keep our eyes on those hands. Right? And we teach them that it's like, you don't do that when you're in a room with somebody else and that person hasn't consented to it. And you can also teach the concept of consent. This is a big piece to me that, you know, in the US, it can be a bit of a logistical nightmare trying to like do sex education for teenagers can be this huge thing, especially in schools, because you usually, especially for special education kids, you usually have to get all the parents to agree, and it's usually contentious, and people, it's a landmine, right? It's a little paperwork landmine, like, who knows? But I would argue we can still, at least starting from a young age, teach bodily consent in terms of bodily autonomy, the concept of autonomy, because that can be applied in these situations, but it's not specific to such sex education. It's just sort of basic decency stuff, you know? And quite frankly, I would usually establish teaching bodily autonomy even to like preschoolers, because like preschoolers will run up and suddenly hug you or like want to jump onto your lap. And if you're not expecting it, you might not catch them. They might get hurt. Also, preschoolers can, you know, they could be sick and have like germy, like snotty nose stuff, and they still want to like just kind of come at you with their little hands. And it's like, you know what? Let's just make a rule. You have to ask first. You have to ask me either with your mouth or with your hands out to show you want to hug, or, you know, use pictures or use a device or something to tell me you want to sit on my lap or you want to hug. Like, you have to tell me first, then you can do it. And I would usually teach it as like, I don't really like being suddenly hugged without knowing. I want to know who's touching me and I want to be ready for it. So please do ask me. And then I would also teach them that they can do the same courtesy to me. So if I want them to hold my hand while we're walking to recess so they don't run off and like get, you know, like kind of body checked by a fifth grader who didn't know they were there, because that could happen, then it's like I would ask them, like, I don't want to grab your hand immediately, but could you hold my hand while we go to recess together? And that's bodily autonomy. That's giving them the right to consent to having their hand held. And if they didn't want to hold my hand, then maybe, okay, can you hold on to the end of this rope or this string, or maybe, you know, hold on to the end of this toy and we'll walk together that way, just so I can make sure you're not running off and, you know, possibly have a big kid run into you and because they don't notice you're there. So it's just a safety thing that happens in schools. And that's just teaching like mutual bodily autonomy and consent, regardless of ages and regardless of how big I am. And the fact that, yes, I could just pick them up and carry them somewhere if I needed to. And if they were in imminent physical danger, I would, right? If they were like running in front of a bus, yeah, I'm going to grab them, move them out of the way. But when it's just everyday interaction type stuff, let's just make sure we both accept and we understand that, you know, we want to be asked before somebody just suddenly touches us or grabs us, right? And then if we teach it, honestly, I think if we teach it young enough, it translates very well to teenagers. It's just a fair number of teenagers usually haven't been taught well enough, especially those with more significant support needs. A lot of people don't teach about bodily autonomy, and a lot of them have their bodily autonomy violated a ton as kids. They get moved around a lot. I mean, kids who, if they use a wheelchair during the school year, they just get moved around without even knowing who's behind them, which is usually dysregulating for most of them. And I usually recommend, like, at least let them know you're there. Let them know who's behind them so that they know who's taking them places if they're not able to self-ambulate. You know, but these are kids who typically get their bodily autonomy violated a lot growing up. They get moved around a lot because of they're having meltdowns, or they're just laying on the floor and they don't want to move. So then the teacher just grabs them and carries them over to the art room or something, you know? And that obviously creates an issue with certain boundaries. Now, on the flip side, these kids usually are very apparent with their autism and or whatever cognitive impairment they have. It's fairly overt. It's fairly obvious. So if they do have this sort of impulsivity, they're usually in a much more controlled environment where the people in charge are aware that that's something that might happen with this population. Basically, I'm saying they're not the kind of people who are going to be given a hosting role on a popular TV show. Okay, these are not people who will be in that position in their life, probably, right? So their impulsivity will likely be handled by caregivers or staff members who are around them all the time. Okay. But for more non-apparent autistics, of which I would call Greg Wallace one, because late diagnosed usually means you're not as apparent, right? Things do need to be taught. Boundaries awfully need to be taught. But if it's purely from a cognitive impulse issue, it's not so specific to environments and situations where the autistic is in the position of power over everybody else there. That's what makes this suspicious. And that's what makes me think, I don't think you can talk about disrobing, dropping your trowel, and not wearing underwear and calling attention to it in front of people and making faces when people are uncomfortable, or whatever it may be. I don't think you can just say, well, that's just, you know, I just didn't know any better because I'm autistic. It's like, you seem to have planned it enough, right? There was enough calculation with the specific situations that this is not just sudden impulsivity, right? And as a late diagnosed man who is in a position of privilege, and I did look him up, he sold that company and made all those multi-million pounds or so when he was like in his mid-20s. So for a fairly significant portion of his life, he's been a pretty wealthy white guy. So, like, he's been in positions of power for a while, okay? And the people who tend to do, or who tend to get away with this type of behavior, 9 times out of 10, they're usually wealthy people in positions of power. They're usually the people who are the boss of everybody. They're the one in charge of everyone. They're the one at the top They're the one at the peak, the little top of their little world, okay? That's usually why they get away with this stuff, right? Because they have so much power over everybody else that nobody else wants to accuse them or to take them to court or whatever it may be. Because that's a huge life disruption and they might not have hard evidence and blah, blah, blah. And the person with all the wealth is the one who can defend themselves more easily in court compared to someone without that much wealth. So it's just very sus. Now, maybe some of the verbal statements can be more of an autistic thing. That's possible due to scripting or something like that, and just not understanding nuances of when to use certain like innuendos versus not. Maybe. Okay. Possibly. But for me, the bigger, like more icky allegations of like disrobing around somebody, I wouldn't even say 100% in public because it doesn't sound, he's not like walking down the streets of London doing it. So he's not that impulsive, right? He clearly can keep pants on, or sorry, trousers. Sorry, any UK viewers, because I know pants are basically what we would call underwear. So very different. But apparently he doesn't wear those either. So there you go. Like he's not doing it in the middle of a department store, you know? He's not going to Harrods and just walking around naked, right? That seems to not be in the headline, so I'm going to guess he's not doing that. He's not going to all these interviews and doing it. So it's like he clearly he can make a choice to do it in certain situations. And the choices where he was alleged to have done it are situations where he was the one with the power. That's the red flag for me. Big red flag. When these behaviors do exist in autistics, they are not as calculated or as planned. It's much more spontaneous. I would have expected a lot more stories about Greg Wallace doing this in a lot of other contexts if keeping pants on was such a struggle. They should be hearing stories about him as a teenager having a struggle with it, or him in the middle of a department store having struggle with it, or him meeting the King of England and having a struggle with it, or, you know, but those stories aren't coming out. So it doesn't sound to me, in my clinical opinion, not that I'm diagnosing anything because I can't and I don't know this guy or anything, but it's not consistent with the clinical profile that I would expect if I was dealing with a patient who had that type of impulsivity as a cognitive impairment. That's what I have to say about that.
We say not safe for work for a reason, and implying that you're incapable of understanding that because you're autistic is offensive to every other autistic adult in the world. Autistic people struggle with employment enough as it is. We don't need to carry a new false stigma. As with Neil Gaiman, there has been no acknowledgement from him that he was in a position of power. And apparently these TV presenters do have a ridiculous amount of power.
I definitely think that there's a great magnetism, a kind of magnetic draw between a certain kind of narcissistic personality and TV and radio. There really does seem to be. What I don't get is this, though, and I've never understood this. If you're the star of the show, you're the star. You're the highest paid person in the room. You're valuable to everybody there. You are very, very well known, celebrated, your name over the door. If you want chopped pineapple for lunch, someone will go and chop your pineapple for you. If you have to have 7 lattes with a caramel squirt, they will get you 7 lattes with a caramel squirt.
To answer that question of why the narcissistic type personalities tend to be drawn to this kind of work, it's because of the power differential. That's why. The power differential and the grandiosity and the fact that everybody agrees and everybody says yes and everybody is like falling over themselves to please you, that is like catnip to somebody with some type of some level of narcissistic stuff going on mentally, right? Like, why wouldn't they want to go into a career where they have massive power differentials and they're the one on the top, you know? It's not too much of a mystery, really, as to why those personalities tend to get drawn and they get all the attention they want. They get all the little fuel, all the little everything.
And he has not acknowledged that opening your door with no pants on is a power move. He claims he sees everyone in the same level. He doesn't really see hierarchy because he's autistic. And that can be a thing.
What came out in the investigation was that I felt myself to be on the same level as them, but they didn't perceive me as such.
But treating the people who are beneath you in that hierarchy that you apparently don't see, treating them very badly, that implies to me that you might just be extremely aware of that hierarchy and also what you're able to get away with, what you feel comfortable doing.
And I would argue that he probably doesn't see everybody equal, because as a man of privilege to a certain level, if he's talking to someone from more lower class, I bet he doesn't see that person as his equal. I'm going to put money down like that. And like I said before, if he was in the presence of the King of England, is he going to see himself as equal to the King of England? I highly doubt it. And maybe that's a fairly dramatic thing, but yeah, no. If you're not seeing hierarchy, it means you're doing this no matter where you are. It means you're doing this when you're at an interview. It means it would likely happen if you're at some sort of formal event, at a gala, at a, charity event or something. It would be happening at all those sort of places, but none of these allegations say that's happening. So that makes me think he is very much aware. There are places later on where he talks about, like, he's a freelancer. He doesn't have that much power. He's totally on contract and a freelancer and this and that. And it's like, dude, he makes so much money. That's not, no. Like, normally, yes, if you're a freelancer the way that, like, Ghost Rider was a freelancer, where, like, she needs the paycheck. But we're not talking about that level of freelancer. We're talking about, like, an entertainment entity who is a big name and known and, probably has a giant staff of people and entire agencies, like, negotiating contracts and stuff. That's a whole different ballgame from, like, gosh, I hope I get a gig. It's not the whole I hope I get it song from Chorus Line that he's dealing with here. So that doesn't really fit either. And also, I think, Meg does go on to talk about how he doesn't really show that there's any kind of understanding for, like, if he was more marginalized, if he was less privileged, if he had less money, if he was a person of color, like, the consequences would be very different. Autism or no, right? It's like he seems to not have any awareness of intersectionality in the criminal system and things like that. And it's like, yeah, because he's been privileged enough not to need to develop any knowledge of that. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully it helps to ground these sort of discussions with a little more nuance. I know nuance is not really social media's strong suit, but this is why I do long form, because I like nuance and complexity. I like to dig into these things, and let's parse out what are red flags of, like, this is an issue with privilege and, all of that versus, this is actually a cognitive thing going on, right? But yeah, on the whole, in my experience, most, like, autistics who have struggles with that level of impulsivity would probably not have ever been at the level of being a host of a cooking show. So yeah, he clearly is capable of learning and doing better. And the fact that he refuses to take accountability and actually learn and truly change, which, go check Meg's video. He claims he changed, but she presents very reasonable evidence that he has not. Not really. So we can say honestly, yeah, it's just problematic male behavior. What do you guys think, though? Do you think it's purely impulsivity? Do you think it's purely more of the privilege thing? Or do you think it's likely a complex mixture of both? There is room here for both things to be true, depending on the behaviors and the situations that he was in. And I think it's important to hold space for both possibilities. But let me know what you think. If you think that it's important to hold that sort of complexity so that, oops, I'm once again bouncing all over the place with this thing. Shoot. Holding a space for where, like, we can be empathetic toward people who have struggles with certain things, and then also holding people accountable and demanding that they learn, essentially, in order to be safer people and to be better people. I think both things are vital when we're talking about disability rights and advocacy and things like that. I mean, this is the whole thing with advocacy and disability rights movements and things like this, is that, like, it's all very complex and nuanced. And when you're talking about something that's a spectrum that's really wide, sometimes it's hard to parse those things out. Let me know if this helped to clarify it. Let me know your thoughts. Do that like, comment, subscribe thing, because that tells the algorithm to send this video out to even more people. I'm so bad at remembering to ask people to do that. And in the meantime, let's use our weirdness powers for good, for the interest of connecting with each other and having a safer community with all of us, and to promote more compassion and understanding. So in that sense, let's all just keep it weird. And until next time, bye. I'm too weird for algorithms, guys, so comment, like, subscribe, do all those things to help these videos dig out to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!